Look, I'm going to tell you something that nobody had the guts to say at your wedding. While everyone was clinking champagne glasses and celebrating what they called the happiest day of your life, you were actually attending a funeral. Your funeral. The funeral of the last version of yourself that belonged entirely to you. That white dress, that perfectly tailored suit, those vows you repeated like a sacred mantra, they weren't symbols of beginning. They were the closing ceremony of your autonomy. And the most brutal part? You paid for it. You smiled through it. You probably even cried tears of joy while signing away the deed to your own existence. Nietzsche saw through this charade over a century ago, and what he discovered would make most married people physically uncomfortable. But here's the thing about uncomfortable truths. They're the only ones worth hearing. Because right now, in this very moment, you're either living in the aftermath of that decision, contemplating making it, or watching someone you love walk blindly toward that altar. And what I'm about to share with you isn't some bitter rant from a cynical philosopher. It's a surgical analysis of how society convinced you that captivity is freedom, that obligation is love, and that the slow death of your individual will is actually something to celebrate with a 3-tier cake and a DJ. The wedding industrial complex makes billions every year selling you the fantasy. The photographers capture those perfect moments. The planners orchestrate every detail. The guests throw rice or flower petals, ancient symbols of fertility because, let's be honest, the machinery of marriage has always been about reproduction, about creating the next generation of people who will also surrender their freedom at an altar. But beneath all that pageantry, beneath the carefully curated Instagram posts and the first dance and the heartfelt speeches, there's a transaction happening. You're trading your sovereign self for a socially approved identity. You're exchanging the terrifying freedom of self-determination for the comfortable prison of coupled existence. And Nietzsche, that magnificent madman who dared to question everything society held sacred, he looked at marriage and saw it for what it truly is. Not a union of souls, not a celebration of love, but a systematic domestication of the human spirit. Now, before you close this video and write me off as some relationship-hating nihilist, understand something crucial. Nietzsche wasn't against love. He wasn't against deep connections between human beings. What he opposed, what he saw as genuinely dangerous, was the institutionalization of love. The moment you take something as wild and unpredictable as genuine human affection, and you trap it inside a legal contract, inside social expectations, inside the suffocating framework of "till death do us part," you've killed it. You've taken something alive and turned it into a preserved specimen. Beautiful to look at maybe, but fundamentally dead. The love that existed before you signed those papers, that raw and risky thing that made your heart race with possibility, that dies the moment you make it mandatory, the moment you turn it from choice into obligation. Because here's what nobody tells you about marriage. Once you've promised forever, you've removed the very thing that made the relationship valuable. The daily choice to stay. The conscious decision to be together not because a piece of paper says you must, but because you genuinely want to. Think about it honestly. And I mean really think about it without the social conditioning, without the romantic comedies playing in your head, without your mother's voice telling you what you should want. When was the last time you did something truly spontaneous? When was the last time you made a major life decision without having to negotiate, compromise, or consider how it affects this other person who now has legal and social claim to your choices? That trip you wanted to take, that career move you considered, that hobby you thought about pursuing, that friend you wanted to spend more time with. How many of those possibilities died in the consultation phase? How many of your authentic desires got filtered through the machinery of marital approval? And here's the really insidious part. You probably don't even notice it anymore. The self-censorship has become so automatic, so deeply wired into your daily existence, that you've forgotten what it feels like to be the sole author of your own life story. You've internalized your own captivity so completely that you call it love. Nietzsche had this concept he called the will to power. Not power over others necessarily, but power over yourself. The ability to become who you truly are, to actualize your highest potential, to create yourself as a work of art. And marriage, at least marriage as society constructs it, is fundamentally opposed to this project. Because marriage demands consistency, it demands predictability, It demands that you be the same person today that you were when you made those vows. But life, real life, the kind of life that Nietzsche celebrated, that's about transformation. It's about evolution. It's about becoming something greater than you currently are. And you cannot do that while shackled to someone else's expectations of who you should remain. The person you married didn't fall in love with who you could become. They fell in love with who you were. And now there's this unspoken contract that you'll stay that way. That you won't grow in directions that make them uncomfortable. That you won't transform into someone they didn't agree to spend their life with. Here's where it gets really dark. Society has convinced us that this limitation is actually a virtue. They call it commitment. They call it maturity. They call it love. But strip away the pretty language, and what are you really talking about? You're talking about two people agreeing to limit each other's potential for growth. You're talking about mutual surveillance. You're talking about a system where your partner becomes the enforcer of your own stagnation. And before you think this is just about bad marriages or people who married the wrong person, understand that this is structural. This isn't about finding the right partner. This is about the institution itself being fundamentally opposed to human flourishing. Even in the best marriages, even when both people genuinely care about each other, the framework of marriage creates dynamics of obligation that corrode authentic choice. When you do something nice for your spouse, is it because you genuinely want to? Or is it because that's what a good husband does? That's what a good wife does? When you compromise on something important to you, is that an act of love? Or is that you fulfilling the terms of a contract you signed when you were too naive to understand what you were agreeing to? Nietzsche talked about master morality versus slave morality. Master morality comes from within. It's self-defined. It's about creating your own values based on what enhances your power and growth. Slave morality comes from external rules and obligations. It's about conforming to what others expect of you. And marriage, my friends, is the ultimate expression of slave morality. It's you outsourcing your ethical framework to social convention. It's you accepting predefined roles, husband, wife, partner, and letting those roles determine your behavior rather than your own authentic will. You're not acting from your own center anymore. You're acting from a script written by a society that has its own agenda. And that agenda has nothing to do with your individual flourishing. Society doesn't care if you're happy. Society cares if you're stable, predictable, controllable. And marriage is one of the primary mechanisms through which society achieves that control. Now let's talk about something nobody mentions during the wedding ceremony. The performance. You know what I'm talking about? That elaborate theater where you pretend to be happier than you've ever been. Where you perform certainty about a decision that should terrify any thinking person. Where you smile for the cameras and assure everyone that yes, this is definitely what you want. Even as some small voice in the back of your mind whispers doubts that you've been trained to ignore. The wedding day isn't really about you and your partner. It's about showing everyone else that you're doing life correctly, that you've achieved the social milestone, that you're a legitimate adult now, because you've agreed to be domesticated. And here's the thing about performances. The more elaborate they are, the more they reveal what we're trying to hide. Why do weddings need to be such massive productions? Why do we need to gather everyone we know and put on this show? Because deep down, we know how absurd the promise is. Till death do us part. You're going to be the same person in 40 years? Your feelings won't change. Life won't throw you curveballs that completely transform who you are. The person you're marrying won't evolve into someone fundamentally different. And you're making this promise anyway? The scale of the wedding is proportional to the scale of the denial. But let me take you deeper into Nietzsche's thinking because this is where it gets really interesting. Nietzsche believed that Christianity had poisoned Western civilization with what he called life-denying values. Values that celebrated suffering, self-sacrifice, and the suppression of natural human instincts. And marriage, especially in its traditional form, is soaked in these Christian values. The idea that you should sacrifice your individual desires for the good of the union. The idea that suffering through a difficult marriage is somehow noble. The idea that your natural instincts for variety, for novelty, for freedom, those are weaknesses to be overcome rather than legitimate human needs to be honored. Marriage asks you to be smaller than you are, to want less than you could have, to dream smaller than your potential, and it frames this diminishment as virtue, as love, as maturity. But Nietzsche saw it differently. He saw it as the slow suicide of your higher self. Let me ask you something, and I want you to be brutally honest with yourself. Not with me, not with anyone else. Just with yourself in the privacy of your own mind. When you think about your life, when you really imagine your ideal existence, does it include all the compromises you're currently making? Does it include all the dreams you've shelved? Does it include checking in before making decisions? Does it include negotiating over money, time, attention? Does it include the constant calculation of what's fair, what's equal, who did more, who sacrificed more? Or does your ideal life look like something wilder, something more free, something more authentically yours? And if there's a gap between your actual life and your ideal life, why? What's creating that gap? Is it circumstances beyond your control? Or is it the very commitment you made standing in front of everyone you know, promising to forsake all others, to cleave only unto this one person, to merge your life so completely with theirs that you can no longer tell where you end and they begin? You know what's interesting about that question? Where are you watching this video from? What city are you in right now? Because no matter where you are, whether you're in New York or London or Tokyo or some small town nobody's heard of, these dynamics are the same. The machinery of marriage operates the same way everywhere because it's not about geography. It's about human psychology and how society has learned to exploit it. It's about universal human needs for connection being twisted into institutionalized control. So drop your city in the comments because I'm genuinely curious how far this message reaches. How many different places in the world have people who are questioning the same sacred cow, who are willing to look at marriage without the rose-colored glasses society hands us? But back to Nietzsche and his surgical dissection of matrimony. He had this idea called eternal recurrence. Imagine that you had to live your exact life over and over again for eternity. Every choice, every moment repeated infinitely. Would you embrace that? Would you say yes to your life as it is? That's the ultimate test of whether you're living authentically, whether your choices genuinely reflect your deepest values and desires, or whether you're just going through motions, fulfilling obligations, playing roles that society assigned you. Now apply that test to your marriage. If you had to be married to this same person, having these same conversations, navigating these same conflicts, making these same compromises, over and over for eternity, would you choose that? Would you embrace it with every fiber of your being? Or would there be this small voice saying, maybe not this, maybe something else, maybe freedom? Most people fail that test. Most people, if they're honest, would not choose their marriages for eternity. They might not even choose them for next year if there weren't social and financial consequences for leaving. They stay because leaving is hard, because divorce is expensive, because people would judge them, because they'd have to admit failure, because starting over is terrifying, because loneliness seems worse than quiet desperation. But staying because leaving is difficult, that's not love. That's not commitment. That's just inertia dressed up in prettier language. And Nietzsche would tell you that this kind of existence, this living of unlived life, this daily compromise with mediocrity, it's worse than death. At least death is honest about being an ending. Marriage pretends to be a beginning while slowly suffocating everything vital in you. Here's another thing nobody tells you. Marriage changes the fundamental nature of your relationship. Before marriage, you choose each other every day. The relationship continues because both people want it to continue. There's something beautiful and terrifying about that. Beautiful because it means the love is real. It's chosen. It's active. Terrifying because it means there's no safety net. The person could leave. You could lose them, and that possibility, that risk, it keeps things alive. It keeps you appreciating what you have. It keeps you showing up as your best self. But after marriage, that changes. Now there's a contract. Now there are legal entanglements. Now there's social pressure. Now leaving requires lawyers and division of assets and explanations to family and friends. The relationship isn't sustained by mutual desire anymore. It's sustained by the cost of exit. And you can feel that shift. Maybe not immediately, maybe not consciously, but over time you feel it. The quality of attention changes. The effort drops. Because why work so hard to keep someone who's legally bound to you? Why maintain the mystery, the excitement, the growth, when you've got them locked down? And this is where Nietzsche's philosophy becomes absolutely devastating to the institution of marriage, because he understood something that most people refuse to acknowledge. Human beings are not static creatures. We are constantly becoming. We are processes, not finished products. The person you are today is not the person you were 5 years ago, and will not be the person you are 5 years from now. Your values shift. Your priorities evolve. Your understanding of yourself deepens and changes. Your dreams transform. Your very identity is fluid, always in motion, always responding to new experiences and insights. But marriage demands that you remain compatible with someone else through all of that change. It demands that two separate processes of becoming somehow stay aligned, stay compatible, stay attracted to each other, despite following their own internal logics of development. The mathematical improbability of that should be obvious. Yet we not only expect it, we build our entire social structure around the assumption that it will happen. We shame people when it doesn't. We call them failures when the reality is that the system itself is designed to fail. Think about who you were when you got married. Really think about that person. What did they want from life? What did they value? What scared them? What excited them? Now look at who you are today. How much have you changed? How much have your desires evolved? How much has your understanding of yourself deepened? And now here's the critical question. Did you get permission for those changes? Did you check with your spouse before evolving into a different person? No. Well, then you violated the implicit contract of marriage. Because marriage is built on the assumption of continuity. Your spouse didn't agree to stay with whoever you might become. They agreed to stay with who you were. Every change you undergo, every way you grow and transform, that's a renegotiation of the original deal. And here's the thing. Nobody talks about this. Nobody acknowledges that marriage is actually a series of different relationships with increasingly different people who happen to share a history and a legal bond. The person you're married to now is not the person you married. You are not the person who got married. You're strangers bound together by a promise made by people who no longer exist. Nietzsche would look at this situation and see it as fundamentally absurd. He would say that promising your future self, a self you cannot possibly know, to remain committed to another future self that you also cannot know, this is the height of human presumption and foolishness. It's you claiming knowledge you don't have, control you don't possess, and stability that doesn't exist in the fundamental nature of reality. It's you trying to make the river hold still, trying to make the flowing fixed, trying to make the process into a product. And when it inevitably fails, when the river keeps flowing and the people keep changing and the compatibility breaks down, society doesn't question the institution. Society questions you. What did you do wrong? Why couldn't you make it work? Why didn't you try harder? As if effort could overcome the basic mathematics of probability and the fundamental nature of human transformation. But let's go even deeper, because Nietzsche's critique of marriage isn't just about personal freedom. It's about what marriage does to excellence, to greatness, to the highest possibilities of human achievement. Nietzsche believed in the Übermensch, the overman, the human being who transcends conventional morality and creates their own values, the person who refuses to be limited by what society says they should be or should want. And marriage, by its very nature, is antithetical to this project. Because the Übermensch requires absolute sovereignty over their own existence. They require the freedom to pursue their vision without compromise, without negotiation, without having to consider how their choices affect someone who has legal and emotional claim to their life. Every great achievement in human history, every breakthrough, every masterpiece, every revolution in thought or art or science, these things required obsessive dedication. They required people willing to sacrifice normal life for extraordinary accomplishment. They required individuals who put their vision above comfort, above security, above social approval. And marriage asks you to do the opposite. It asks you to prioritize stability over growth, to choose security over risk, to value someone else's comfort over your own potential. Now you might say, but what about partnership? What about having someone support your dreams? And sure, that sounds nice in theory. But be honest about what actually happens. How many artists never created their masterpiece because they had to pay the mortgage? How many entrepreneurs never took the leap because they had a family to support? How many philosophers, writers, innovators, dreamers, How many of them died with their greatest work still inside them because they chose marriage over mission? And I'm not saying everyone should be pursuing some grand artistic or intellectual vision. I'm saying that marriage, by design, makes that pursuit nearly impossible. It domesticates ambition. It tames the wild urge to create, to build, to transform yourself in the world. It channels your energy into maintaining a household, raising children, meeting obligations, being a good partner. And all of that might be fine if it's genuinely what you want. But is it? Or is it what you were told to want? What you were conditioned to pursue? What you accepted as the inevitable path because everyone around you was doing the same thing? Nietzsche had tremendous respect for solitude. He saw it not as loneliness, but as the necessary condition for deep thought, for genuine self-knowledge, for the kind of rigorous self-examination that leads to authentic living. And marriage is the death of solitude. Not just the practical solitude of living alone, but the psychological solitude of being completely responsible only to yourself. Once you're married, you're never truly alone with your thoughts, because your thoughts are always considering this other person, their needs, their feelings, their reactions. Your internal monologue becomes a dialogue. Your self-reflection becomes contaminated with concern for how your conclusions might affect your relationship. You lose the purity of selfish contemplation. And I use selfish in the Nietzschean sense, not as something bad, but as something necessary. The ability to be thoroughly, completely concerned with your own development, your own truth, your own path. Marriage makes that impossible. It forces you to be perpetually other-directed, to consider how your choices impact someone else, to negotiate your own growth through the lens of maintaining a relationship. And children. Oh God, let's talk about children because that's where the trap really closes. Society sells you this beautiful narrative about parenthood, about legacy, about the meaning that comes from raising the next generation. But Nietzsche would ask you to consider what you're actually doing. You're creating new human beings who will demand even more of your time, energy, attention, and resources, who will make even greater claims on your freedom, who will give you even more excuses to abandon any dreams of becoming something extraordinary. You'll tell yourself it's worth it, that there's meaning in sacrifice, that love for your children justifies the death of your own potential. But is that true? Or is that just the story you tell yourself to make peace with a choice you can no longer undo? How many parents live vicariously through their children because they gave up on living their own lives? How many push their kids to achieve what they never could because they sacrifice their own ambitions on the altar of family? And the really insidious part is that this creates a cycle. Your children watch you give up your dreams for them. They internalize the message that this is what love looks like, what maturity looks like, what responsibility looks like. And then they grow up and do the same thing. They get married, they have kids, they sacrifice their potential, and the machinery of mediocrity continues. Generation after generation, everyone telling themselves that this is what life is supposed to be. But here's what Nietzsche understood that most people refuse to see. The question isn't whether marriage and family can bring happiness. Obviously they can, in the same way that any comfortable routine can bring a kind of contentment. The question is whether that happiness is the highest form of human flourishing, whether settling into domestic tranquility is really the best thing you could do with your one wild and precious life. And Nietzsche's answer is a resounding no. He believed that the highest human achievements come from discomfort, from struggle, from the willingness to stand apart from the herd and pursue something greater than social approval. Marriage and family, they're fundamentally about joining the herd, about doing what everyone else does, about finding your place in the social order. And yes, that comes with certain rewards, companionship, stability, social legitimacy, but it also comes with a cost. The cost is your edge, your wildness, your potential for greatness. You trade the possibility of becoming extraordinary for the guarantee of being ordinary. And most people make that trade without even realizing what they're giving up. Let's talk about sex, because that's another dimension where marriage reveals its fundamentally life-denying nature. Human beings are sexual creatures with a natural drive for variety, novelty, and excitement. This isn't controversial. This is biology. We evolved in an environment where sexual variety was normal, where monogamy was not the default setting. But marriage takes this fundamental aspect of human nature and tries to channel it exclusively toward one person for decades. And we've built this entire moral framework around the idea that this is not just possible, but desirable, that wanting sexual variety is somehow immature or selfish or a sign of insufficient love. But Nietzsche would ask, why is it more noble to repress natural desires than to honor them? Why is self-denial considered virtuous when it leads to frustration, resentment, and the slow death of erotic vitality? The standard marriage script is that sexual excitement fades over time, that this is normal and expected, that you trade passion for comfort. But have you noticed that we only accept this narrative in the context of marriage? If someone said their passion for music was fading, or their excitement about travel was diminishing, we wouldn't say, oh, that's just natural, that's what happens. We'd say you need to find ways to reignite that passion, to bring back the excitement. But in marriage, we accept the death of eros as inevitable. We even celebrate it as maturity. Look how comfortable we are with each other. Look how we can be together without that desperate early passion, as if the absence of desire is something to aspire to. And monogamy itself, let's be clear about what it actually is. It's a property arrangement. Historically, marriage was about ensuring paternity, about making sure a man's resources went to his biological children. Women were essentially property, traded between families, their sexuality controlled and monitored to preserve family bloodlines and wealth. We've modernized the language around marriage, made it sound more egalitarian, more about love and partnership. But the fundamental structure remains. You still own each other sexually. You still have exclusive rights to each other's bodies. Infidelity is still treated as a violation of property rights, a theft of something that belongs to the betrayed spouse. And we enforce this ownership with tremendous social and emotional pressure. The betrayed partner gets sympathy. The cheater gets condemnation, not because of the lying necessarily, but because they gave away something that wasn't theirs to give. They violated the sexual property rights established by the marriage contract. Nietzsche would look at this system and see it for what it is: a mechanism of control dressed up as love, a way of domesticating the sexual impulse, making it serve the interests of social stability rather than individual vitality and freedom. Now I can hear the objection forming in your mind. But what about love? What about genuine connection? What about the beauty of sharing your life with someone? And look, I'm not denying that deep human connection is valuable. I'm not saying that love isn't real or powerful or important. What I'm saying is that the institution of marriage, the legal and social framework we've built around love, that actually undermines the very things it claims to celebrate. Real love, authentic connection. It's free. It's chosen. It exists because both people genuinely want to be together, not because a contract says they have to be. The moment you institutionalize love, the moment you make it a legal obligation backed by social pressure and financial consequences, you've transformed it into something else entirely. You've made it a duty, and duty, no matter how you dress it up, is not the same as desire. When your partner does something kind for you, when they show you affection, when they make love to you, there's always this question lurking underneath. Are they doing this because they want to, or because that's what a good spouse does? And you never quite know. Neither do they. Because the whole system is designed to blur the line between authentic choice and obligatory performance. Nietzsche talked about resentment, this deep-seated resentment that comes from powerlessness, from having to suppress your natural instincts and desires. And marriage is a breeding ground for resentment. You resent your partner for the freedoms you've sacrificed. You resent them for the dreams you've deferred. You resent them for simply being the person you chose to bind yourself to, even though that was your choice. And because you can't express this resentment directly, because that would violate the scripts of marriage, you express it in passive-aggressive ways, in small criticisms, in subtle punishments, in the slow accumulation of grievances that eventually poison even the good moments. You keep score. Who did more housework? Who made more sacrifices? Who's more invested in the relationship? And this scorekeeping, this constant calculation of fairness and equity, it's the opposite of love. It's a business partnership at best. And most business partnerships have better exit clauses than marriage. Here's something else nobody talks about: the performance of happiness. How much of your married life is spent trying to convince others and yourself that you made the right choice? How much energy goes into maintaining the facade? You post the happy photos, you tell the sweet stories, you celebrate anniversaries with public declarations of love. But how much of that is authentic? And how much is you trying to justify a decision you're not sure about? How much is you trying to convince yourself that the trade-off was worth it? Because admitting that marriage was a mistake, admitting that you're not as happy as you thought you'd be, that's social suicide. That's failure. So you double down. You post more happy photos. You tell yourself that all marriages have rough patches. You convince yourself that your quiet desperation is normal, that everyone feels this way, that this is just what adult life is like. But is it? Or is that just what we tell ourselves to make peace with our cages? Nietzsche believed that most people are afraid of freedom, that they actually want to be told what to do, how to live, what to value, that they seek out institutions and ideologies that will relieve them of the burden of self-determination. And marriage is the perfect expression of this fear. It gives you a ready-made identity, husband, wife, partner. It gives you a clear set of obligations and expectations. It gives you a socially approved script for how to live. You don't have to figure out who you are or what you want, because society has already decided that for you. You're married now. That's who you are. That's what you do. You maintain the relationship. You build a life together. You maybe have kids. You save for retirement. You grow old together. It's all mapped out. All you have to do is follow the script, and for most people, that's a relief. The vast open possibility of an unscripted life. That's terrifying. What if you make the wrong choices? What if you waste your potential? What if you end up alone? Better to accept the script even if it means giving up the possibility of something greater. Better to be safely mediocre than risk being magnificently yourself. But Nietzsche didn't write for most people. He wrote for the few who are willing to reject the script, who are willing to endure the discomfort of freedom, who would rather risk everything in pursuit of their highest potential than accept a comfortable compromise with mediocrity. And if you're still watching this video, if you've stayed with me through this entire analysis, then maybe you're one of those few. Maybe something in you recognizes the truth in what I'm saying, even if it makes you uncomfortable, even if it challenges everything you've been taught to believe about love and commitment and what it means to live a good life. Maybe there's a part of you that's been whispering these same doubts, these same questions, and you've been silencing that voice because listening to it would require you to make difficult choices, to admit uncomfortable truths, to potentially dismantle a life you've spent years building. And look, I'm not telling you to get divorced. I'm not telling you to avoid marriage if that's genuinely what you want. What I'm telling you is to be honest with yourself about what you're doing and why, to question the assumptions, to examine whether your choices are really yours or whether they're scripts you've accepted from a society that doesn't necessarily have your best interests at heart, to consider whether the life you're living is the life you would choose if you were truly free from social pressure and expectation. Because here's the thing, you only get one life, one shot at this, and every day you spend living according to someone else's script is a day you're not living authentically, is a day you're betraying your highest potential, is a day you're choosing comfort over truth. And at the end of your life, when you're looking back on all your choices, all your compromises, all the dreams you deferred and the possibilities you never explored, what's going to matter more? That you did what society expected, or that you lived in accordance with your own deepest truth? Nietzsche died alone, broken after years of illness and isolation. Society would look at his life and call it tragic. No wife, no children, no stable career, just his books and his ideas. But Nietzsche himself, I think he would have embraced that life, would have chosen it again, because he lived according to his own values. He pursued his vision without compromise. He said what he believed even when it cost him everything. He was free in the most profound sense, free from the tyranny of social approval, free from the need to be understood or accepted, free to become exactly who he was meant to be. And his ideas, those dangerous, uncomfortable ideas, they've survived him. They've influenced millions. They've changed how we think about morality, about meaning, about what it means to be human. Would any of that have been possible if he'd chosen the safe path? If he'd gotten married and settled down and lived a normal, socially approved life? We both know the answer. The domestication that marriage demands, it's incompatible with the kind of radical thinking and living that produces genuinely transformative work. Now you might be thinking, but I'm not trying to be Nietzsche. I'm not trying to be a great philosopher or artist or revolutionary thinker. I just want to be happy. And that's fair. That's legitimate. But here's what you need to understand. Happiness is not a goal. It's a byproduct. It's what happens when you're living in alignment with your deepest values and truest nature. And for most people, the happiness they find in marriage isn't that kind of happiness. It's not the happiness of authentic living. It's the happiness of relief. Relief that they've checked the box. Relief that they're doing what they're supposed to do. Relief that they're not alone. It's the happiness of anxiety reduction, not the happiness of genuine flourishing. There's a difference between being comfortable and being alive, between being content and being vital, between existing and truly living. And marriage, for all its comforts, tends to produce the former rather than the latter. Think about the word settle. We use it in two ways when talking about relationships. We talk about settling down, which society treats as a positive thing, a sign of maturity. And we talk about settling for someone, which everyone agrees is negative. But aren't they the same thing? Isn't settling down just a more socially acceptable way of describing settling for? You're settling for a life that's smaller than what you could have. You're settling for the known over the unknown. You're settling for security over possibility. And again, maybe that's genuinely what you want. Maybe you've examined your deepest desires and concluded that stability and companionship are more valuable to you than freedom and possibility. But have you actually done that examination? Or have you just accepted what society told you to want? Because society has a vested interest in you settling down. Settled people are predictable. They're controllable. They're invested in the system. They're not going to rock the boat because they have too much to lose. They're going to show up for work, pay their taxes, raise their children to do the same. They're cogs in the machine. And the machine runs smoothly when everyone accepts their role. But what if you're not meant to be a cog? What if you're meant to be something wilder, something more dangerous, something that doesn't fit neatly into society's approved categories? What if the feeling you get sometimes, that sense that there should be more to life than this? What if that's not just restlessness or immaturity, or a grass is greener delusion? What if that's your authentic self trying to break through the layers of conditioning and expectation? What if that's the voice of your highest potential calling you towards something greater than domestic tranquility? Nietzsche would tell you to listen to that voice, to honor it, to follow it even when it leads you away from safety and approval, because that voice is more trustworthy than all the well-meaning advice from people who have accepted their own cages and now want you to accept yours. The tragedy of marriage isn't that it fails so often. The tragedy is that it succeeds, that people stay together for decades, maintaining the form of the relationship long after the substance has died, that they keep performing their roles, going through the motions, pretending to themselves and everyone else that this is what they wanted, that they die having never known what they could have been, what they could have created, what they could have experienced if they'd had the courage to walk away from the script. And I know how harsh that sounds. I know it goes against everything you've been taught about commitment and perseverance and working through difficulties. But sometimes the brave thing isn't staying. Sometimes the brave thing is leaving. Sometimes the most profound act of self-love and self-respect is admitting that you made a choice based on incomplete information, that you're not the person you were when you made that choice, and that continuing to honor a promise made by someone you've outgrown is actually a betrayal of who you've become. Nietzsche had this idea about eternal return that I mentioned earlier, but let me take it deeper. He asked, what if a demon came to you and told you that you would have to live your exact life over and over again for eternity, with no possibility of change? Would that thought crush you, or would you embrace it? Would you say, yes, this life, exactly as it is, again and again forever? That's the test. That's how you know if you're living authentically. And most married people, if they're honest, would not pass that test. They would not choose their marriages for eternity. They might not even choose them for another year if there were no consequences for leaving. They're enduring their relationships, not embracing them. They're getting through them, not celebrating them. And that's no way to live. That's a slow death masquerading as life. That's cowardice disguised as commitment. And here's the really brutal truth that nobody wants to acknowledge. Your spouse probably feels the same way. They're probably also enduring rather than embracing. They're probably also wondering what their life could have been. They're probably also performing contentment, while feeling increasingly hollow inside. But neither of you can admit it, because that would mean acknowledging that you've both wasted years, maybe decades, living a lie. That would mean facing the sunk cost fallacy, the idea that because you've already invested so much, you can't walk away now. But the sunk cost fallacy is a cognitive bias. It's not rational. The time you've already spent doesn't obligate you to spend more. Each day is a new choice. Each moment is an opportunity to begin living authentically, or to continue betraying yourself. The choice is always yours, even when you pretend it isn't. So let me bring this full circle back to where we started. Your wedding day. That moment when you stood in front of everyone you knew and made promises you couldn't possibly keep. When you traded your sovereignty for social approval. When you agreed to let someone else have veto power over your choices. When you accepted a predefined role instead of creating your own. Was it worth it? Are you living the life you truly want? Or are you living the life you think you're supposed to want? And if there's a gap between those two things, what are you going to do about it? Because you can spend the rest of your life making excuses, blaming circumstances, telling yourself that everyone feels this way. Or you can have the courage to admit that maybe, just maybe, Nietzsche was right. Maybe marriage is fundamentally opposed to human flourishing. Maybe the freedom you gave up on your wedding day was more valuable than what you got in return. Maybe it's not too late to reclaim it. I want you to do something for me right now. Drop a comment with this exact phrase, "I choose my highest self." Not because I'm trying to get engagement, though I appreciate it, but because saying it out loud, even in a YouTube comment, that's a small act of reclamation. That's you acknowledging that there's a part of you that wants more than what society says you should accept. That's you taking the first tiny step toward living authentically instead of living according to the script. So do it now. Write "I choose my highest self" in the comments. Let that be your declaration of intent. Your acknowledgement that you're willing to at least consider the possibility that everything you've been taught about marriage and relationships and the good life might be wrong. And while you're down there in the comments, hit that subscribe button, because you clearly value ideas that challenge conventional wisdom, perspectives that make you uncomfortable in productive ways, content that doesn't just tell you what you want to hear, but what you need to hear. This channel is dedicated to exactly that kind of philosophical depth and intellectual honesty. And smash that like button, because this video took courage to make, sharing ideas that most people are too afraid to voice, questioning institutions that society treats as sacred, offering perspectives that will probably get me attacked in the comments. Your like tells me that there are still people out there who value truth over comfort, who are willing to question everything, who refuse to accept easy answers to complex questions. And here's what's coming next, because I'm not done with this exploration. The next video is going to challenge something even more fundamental than marriage. Something that most people never question, because questioning it feels like questioning reality itself. I'm going to show you how the thing you think is your greatest strength is actually your deepest prison. How the identity you've built so carefully is the very thing preventing you from becoming who you could be. It's going to make this video seem gentle by comparison. You're going to feel attacked. You're going to want to close the video, but you're also going to keep watching, because once you start seeing through the illusions, you can't unsee them. Once you taste real freedom of thought, you can't go back to comfortable delusions. So make sure you're subscribed, because that video drops soon, and you don't want to miss what comes next in this journey toward authentic living and genuine self-knowledge.